Haruya wished to spend his school life peacefully. It was a small desire, without any grand ambitions. Meanwhile, outside the window, the leaves were falling slowly. On the other side of the glass, some girls were chatting without a care in the world, while he remained seated, immersed in his thoughts. However, that simple wish came to an end the very moment the school year began. From that point on, the story unfolded of how he came to meet those whom everyone called the class girls. With that in mind, his school life continued on its course. He was Akasaki Haruya, someone who lived each day trying not to stand out. During one class, a student remembered that the homework notebook needed to be submitted and asked for it to be passed along. In that context, a classmate approached the protagonist with a bit of shyness, intending to ask for his notebook. Haruya handed it over silently, without showing any expression. She, somewhat nervous, managed to thank him in a barely audible voice. A month had already passed since he had entered high school. During that time, Haruya had arrived at a simple conclusion. No one cared about his reputation. His role as a background character in the class had already been firmly established, and the reason for that had a clear name. In that class, there were three figures who outshone everything around them. They were the three girls everyone referred to as the class's beauty trio. First was Kohinata Rin, the central figure of the group, who had a natural charisma and a charming face that effortlessly drew attention. Next was Takamori Yuna, a girl of striking beauty, known for her long, shiny black hair. Lastly, Hankawa Sara, a girl with a noble appearance, whose elegance, sweetness, and refined manners could captivate anyone at first sight. In every sense, she was a beautiful young woman. It was then that an unexpected presence interrupted his moment of contemplation. Kazamiya Yuuki, his classmate, had been watching him. He approached casually and confronted him directly, confidently stating that he had seen him staring at the class's beauties for a while. Then, with a suggestive tone, he hinted that maybe Haruya got along with one of them. However, that wasn't the case. Haruya replied that he had no relationship with them whatsoever, also clarifying that he wasn't interested in them at all. Hearing this, Yuuki seemed to understand the situation and, with a thoughtful expression, commented that he now realized why Haruya was always alone in class. Haruya responded with a brief, emotionless laugh. Immediately after, Yuuki advised him to at least try to show some interest in his classmate. Nevertheless, from Haruya's perspective, Yuuki was like an unexpected storm, impossible to control. Everything was clear to him. A loner like himself had absolutely nothing to do with those girls, even if some sort of connection were to arise with any of them. He knew it would only bring trouble, especially due to the jealousy of others, and since he had no intention of changing his way of life, there was no possibility of them ever interacting. Besides, even though he didn't have any friends at school, he already had his own plans once classes were over. Haruya figured it would be best to hurry home. Inside the bathroom, he began to change. He took off his glasses, swapped his school shirt for more casual clothes, and picked up his bag. He didn't say a word, only the subtle sound of changing clothes marked the transition to another part of his routine. In front of the mirror, Haruya paused for a few seconds to look at himself. He was always meticulous. He didn't want his classmates to find out what he did outside of school, so every detail had to be perfectly in place. His transformation was complete. Before, glasses and a school-styled haircut. After, no glasses, relaxed hair, a white t-shirt, and a jacket. A completely different image. As he exited, Haruya pushed the door open with determination and muttered to himself that it was time to go. In front of him, at the bookstore, shoujo magazines were on display. There was something he eagerly looked forward to every day. As his after-school plans were always the same, he went to buy shoujo manga daily. Haruya held a magazine with excitement, letting out an almost childlike giggle. To him, that meant more than anything else. He preferred spending time that way, devoted to what he truly enjoyed, rather than sharing meaningless moments with someone. He remembered perfectly what had happened in the previous volume of his favorite manga. The heroine had been attacked by a thug, and at the climax of the scene, the male protagonist had appeared just in time to save her. Haruya had been eagerly awaiting the continuation, absolutely certain that the protagonist would rescue her in a really cool way. Without warning, Haruya's thoughts were interrupted. In the distance, a man's voice rose, speaking casually to someone. The man was suggesting to a girl that she should become a model. Turning toward the pair, Haruya could see the young woman visibly rejecting the offer, nervously gesturing as she politely declined, trying to keep her distance. From where he stood, Haruya watched the scene closely. He couldn't help but wonder if the man was really a model scout, though something about his attitude sparked a deep sense of distrust. To Haruya, it felt more like the guy was just trying to hit on her. There was no doubt the girl was pretty. However, beyond her appearance, there was something about her voice that struck him as familiar. He couldn't quite place where he'd heard it before, but he was certain he had. More importantly, something about the whole situation stirred a disturbing feeling inside him. It was as if the scene had been pulled straight out of a shoujo manga. Meanwhile, the man kept getting closer. The girl, visibly uncomfortable, began to plead with him. In a trembling voice, she asked him, begged him, to stop. Her expression turned into a desperate plea. Haruya remained still. The scene unfolding before his eyes was crystal clear. He hesitated, unsure if he should step in. On one hand, he felt it wasn't his place to get involved. He didn't want to attract trouble or attention. On the other hand, something inside him just wouldn't let him stay motionless. He didn't have the kind of mindset that could allow him to stand by and do nothing. Suddenly, the man grabbed the girl forcefully, causing her to let out a sharp, desperate scream. Haruya gasped. His breath quickened, and in his mind, a clear image surfaced. He thought that if he were like the protagonist of that shoujo manga, he definitely wouldn't hesitate. And so, without thinking any further, he began walking toward them, his steps filled with resolve. His voice came out firm and direct. He raised his tone and confronted the situation. With a swift motion, he grabbed the man's hand tightly and stopped him. The man immediately cried out, claiming it hurt. The girl looked at Haruya in surprise, clearly not expecting anyone to intervene. Haruya stood there, in front of her, wearing a determined expression. In that moment, his world stopped being a quiet story. For the first time, he wasn't just a spectator in a scene like this. He was part of it. From behind, a loud voice rang out. The man shouted angrily, demanding to know what Haruya wanted. Outwardly, Haruya's face remained calm, but inside, it was a completely different story. Sweat trickled down his temples, clear evidence of the nervousness taking hold of him. Right behind him, a blonde girl with glasses watched in silence, saying nothing. Inside his mind, everything was chaos. He'd already taken the step to rescue her, but now he had no idea what to do next. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break free from his chest. Despite his neutral expression, internally, he was screaming without pause. He was afraid. Yet amid that whirlwind of emotion, he gathered his courage and replied firmly. He told the guy to stop acting like a child. The other boy clicked his tongue in annoyance, then turned around and walked away in frustration, cursing and convinced that the girl must already have a boyfriend. Haruya stood still for a moment, confusion still written on his face as he tried to convince himself that they were, in fact, safe now. The girl tried to speak. Nervous and hesitant, she barely managed to get a word out. Just then, Haruya turned to look at her, and that was when she unexpectedly took his hand. He froze completely, as if time had stopped. She held his hand gently, without saying anything more. Their hands remained intertwined. Haruya, sweating and utterly embarrassed, could only stammer an apology. He murmured that he was sorry as he tried to let go of her hand. However, with a calmness that contrasted with the tension of the moment, she thanked him. Then, in a kind tone, she asked him to get home safely. Haruya, more nervous than ever, barely managed to stammer a rushed "excuse me" before hurrying away. The girl, surprised, watched him as he walked off. Alone in the spot where it had all happened, she held her hands together, still in shock over what had just taken place. Her face was motionless, completely lost in thought. The scene, at last, grew quiet, almost magical, while, at the same time, the protagonist was back in his apartment. In his room, Haruya could no longer contain himself. He jumped onto the bed, shouting in desperation. At that moment, the scene from the incident came rushing back to his mind like an unstoppable avalanche. He remembered exactly what he had said, and thought he never imagined he would say something so cheesy. Then, he covered his head with a pillow, wishing he could disappear completely. He recalled the moment he held that girl's hand, and almost immediately, her face returned vividly to his mind. He thought about her, and then wondered whether she had made it home safely. When Monday arrived, the classroom was filled with chatter, as the students were animatedly talking with each other. Haruya, sitting in his seat, was thinking excitedly about the latest volume of the manga he had read. However, his thoughts were interrupted by an exclamation nearby. A cheerful voice spoke enthusiastically. Rin, visibly thrilled, was asking her friend if it was true that a boy had helped her turn down someone who was hitting on her, saying it sounded amazing. She then turned to Yuna, seeking her opinion. Yuna, more serious, admitted she had been scared, but also remarked that things like that really did happen. Meanwhile, Haruya listened from his seat. He thought to himself that Himekawa-san had trouble with pushy people. Then, Sarah, with calm composure, said that someone had helped her when a person wouldn't stop bothering her, and that, unfortunately, she hadn't been able to thank him properly. She added that he could have just ignored her, like so many others had. Upon hearing this, Haruya thought she was a very noble person, and found her truly admirable. At that moment, Rin and Yuna asked Sarah if she had asked for the boy's contact number, which caused Sarah to completely freeze. Immediately afterward, Rin slammed her hands on the desk in excitement, exclaiming that it sounded like fate, while Yuna added that it felt like a scene straight out of a shoujo manga. Sarah remained silent for a moment. Then, her cheeks turned a deep red and her eyes widened. She was visibly flustered by the idea. Suddenly, she stood up abruptly and shouted that he wasn't that kind of person. Stammering, she added that she already had someone chosen by her family, and for that reason, she couldn't think about anyone else. Upon hearing this, her friends looked at her in surprise. Rin, lowering her head slightly, told her she was very mature. All of this happened while Haruya quietly watched them from his seat. He thought about Himekawa-san's story from a moment ago and considered that he had also saved a girl, but he felt the boy they were talking about must have been way cooler. The image of the bespectacled girl he had helped flashed in his mind, and the more he listened, the more differences he noticed, which only made him feel worse. He had to admit, the girl he helped was also cute, like Himekawa-san, but even so, he thought that kind of coincidence was impossible. Eventually, he closed his eyes and reflected. At that moment, he believed their conversation had absolutely nothing to do with him. He watched them laughing by the window, never imagining that time would eventually lead him to share more moments with them, something he couldn't even begin to suspect at the time. Later, as he walked through the city, the memory of the conversation between the class's beauties came back to him. For some reason, it felt oddly familiar, but he figured it was probably just his imagination. Then, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Nayu had sent him a message asking if he had already read the manga she had recommended. He then put on his dark sunglasses to remain unnoticed and thought about how she was the only friend he could talk to about his hobby, so he had to reply carefully. He walked into the cafe and greeted the staff with a timid, "Excuse me." One of the employees told him they would take him to his seat in a moment. He smiled to himself, thinking that for someone who lived alone, this place was his favorite. Ever since entering high school, coming to this cafe 3 times a week had become a routine. However, something caught his attention and made his eyes open wide with surprise. A girl was waving at him cheerfully. Haruya returned the greeting, a bit confused, and then recognized her. It was Kohinata-san, none other than Rin, one of the 3 school beauties. She immediately asked if he'd be ordering the usual, to which he replied that yes, that would be fine. Then, he observed her more closely, focusing on her eyes, and thought to himself, she was waitress Kohinata-san. He looked at her in her waitress uniform and thought that she looked incredibly similar to Kohinata-san, one of the class's beauties. At that moment, she smiled mischievously and leaned in to whisper that her break was about to start, asking him to wait just a bit. Haruya looked at her in surprise and scratched his head in embarrassment. Then he watched her walk away, thinking to himself that Kohinata-san wouldn't normally do something like that, and added internally that she didn't seem to fully grasp the concept of personal space. Meanwhile, he checked his phone and remembered he still needed to reply to Nayu-san. However, his phone vibrated again, and messages from Nayu popped up on the screen. first asking if he had read her previous message, then confirming that he had seen it. Seeing that, Haruya thought she was probably already upset, so he replied quickly, apologizing and saying he had gotten lost in thought, then added that, by the way, something odd had happened in class. At that moment, his food was served and the waitress apologized for the wait. Haruya looked at her and thanked her. She gave him a soft expression, which made him shiver slightly. Nervously and blushing, she wished him a good meal. Haruya was confused. He thought her attitude had suddenly changed again, as she had switched back to her formal waitress tone. Curious, he asked her what was going on, to which she replied that it was nothing. He was just about to enjoy his food, excited. He commented that it looked delicious, and with determination, wished himself a good meal. However, Kohinata appeared once again, with a playful smile, cheerfully saying, "Excuse me," she asked what he was doing. Then, without really thinking, she answered herself, the usual. Haruya looked at her in silence, already somewhat used to this, and accepted her presence without much energy. Then, she reminded him of the bond they shared, insisting that she already knew what their relationship was like. With enthusiasm, she tried to start a conversation. However, just then, Haruya received a message that completely distracted him. It was from Nayu-san, saying something strange had also happened to her. Haruya, intrigued, asked what had happened. Meanwhile, without him paying attention, Kohinata continued trying to keep the conversation going. Realizing he wasn't listening, she grew annoyed and asked firmly if he was even hearing her. Flustered, she shouted that someone had tried to hit on a friend of hers. At the same time, Haruya read Nayu's message, which said exactly the same thing. He choked from the shock and froze. Kohinata, seeing his reaction, panicked and asked if he was okay. Still shaken, he replied between coughs that yes, everything was fine. She let out a silent sigh, visibly relieved. In that moment, Haruya's thoughts raced. A sensation swirled in his head, as if the world were spinning. He wondered whether this getting hit on thing happened often. He reflected that, if he wasn't mistaken, the conversation between the class's beauties had also been about someone being hit on. He remembered that just the day before, he had witnessed something like that for the first time. Kohinata tried to explain that the person someone tried to flirt with was a friend of hers. Then she laughed nervously and scratched her head. Seeing her reaction, Haruya asked if he was supposed to doubt her. With a dry expression, he replied that he understood now, it was a friend. Meanwhile, he thought that Kohinata-san was rather simple, though still pretty enough to consider her a beautiful girl. Then he remembered Nayu-san, the one he had met in person to talk about manga, late at night on a quiet street. He also thought she was very pretty. Even though he couldn't say for sure, since she wore those dark sunglasses, he was fairly confident she was a beauty. Then, he thought about the girl from the day before, also a beauty, though he didn't think he'd ever see her again. However, a sudden doubt overcame him, eyes wide open. He wondered if that could really be possible. Was he, without realizing it, surrounded by girls? His face lit up with excitement, and he raised his fists as if he'd just made a huge discovery. But Kohinata interrupted him by raising her voice, asking again if he was even listening. Then, exhausted, she slumped over the table with a frustrated sigh. Haruya, for his part, was completely lost in thought. Kohinata, her cheeks flushed and looking somewhat sad, murmured quietly that she had just wanted to hear a romantic story from him. Haruya didn't hear her clearly and asked what she had said. Completely embarrassed, she shouted that she hadn't said anything. Finally, in a wider scene, the shopping center came into view. Haruya walked past the storefronts, deep in thought. He was reflecting on both Nayu-san's message and Kohinata-san's words. While picking out a t-shirt, he came to a conclusion, just as he had suspected. The fact that beautiful girls were often the target of other guys was something that happened all the time. At that moment, a blonde girl accidentally bumped into Haruya. She immediately startled, visibly embarrassed, and quickly apologized. While holding the shirt and calmly checking the price, Haruya reacted with composure. In his mind, he simply thought it was fine. However, he soon noticed something odd. The girl's legs were trembling slightly. That's when he reached out his hand, warning her to be careful, an attempt to keep her from falling. Haruya managed to react in time and caught her just before she hit the ground. Concerned, he asked if she was okay. The girl straightened up quickly and thanked him. Haruya looked at her curiously, intrigued by her expression. There was something familiar about her. He kept watching her closely until an image flashed through his mind. He remembered a scene from the past and wondered if this girl could be the same one. For her part, the young woman looked at him and immediately recognized him. Without hesitation, she pointed directly at him and said he was the one from that day. Haruya froze completely. He thought it couldn't be. That kind of coincidence just didn't happen in real life. Nervously, he began searching for a way to escape the situation. With a rushed excuse, he told her he hoped she was okay and said they'd see each other around, trying to walk away as quickly as possible. As he moved away, he thought that if he kept showing up in places she frequented, he might come off as creepy, so he figured it would be best to leave as soon as possible. However, the girl stopped him. She grabbed his arm decisively to hold him back and asked him, politely but firmly, to please wait a moment. Her face showed a mix of determination and blush. In a soft yet steady voice, she said she wanted to thank him. Haruya felt overwhelmed by the situation and tried to decline politely. He told her it wasn't necessary. Even so, she looked a little sad. Still blushing, she asked if she couldn't thank him properly. Haruya stayed silent for a moment, wondering if leaving her with that lingering sense of debt was making her feel uneasy. In the end, he agreed. Then, the girl smiled with relief, took his hand confidently, and thanked him. And so, they walked together, holding hands. She led the way, cheerful, and confidently proposed they go. She looked at him with a warm and serene expression. No words were needed in that moment. They simply walked forward through the corridor. She hummed a tune happily. In a soft voice, she assured him there was nothing to worry about, that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Haruya was sweating from nerves. From a bird's eye view, the scene showed them sitting at a cafe, surrounded by empty tables. She had a bright, cheerful aura, and without hesitation, thanked him again, not just for the previous time, but also for what had happened that day. She said she was truly grateful. Haruya responded with a sincere smile, telling her not to worry. Besides, she had already treated him to such a delicious cake. Suddenly, the girl stood up from her seat, began gesturing enthusiastically, and started speaking excitedly. She said the cake had exceeded her expectation. She added that a lot of times she didn't even know what she was expecting, but that one, definitely, had been amazing. She kept talking non-stop. Energetically, she mentioned that people often told her she was picky, though in truth, she didn't understand what they meant by that. Haruya, surprised by her attitude, thought she was very energetic. Then he told her so. He said that as soon as they started talking about what they liked or disliked, she became very lively. Hearing that, the girl realized how enthusiastic she'd been. She looked down, embarrassed, and apologized, but Haruya reassured her with a relaxed smile. He told her there was no need to apologize. After all, it was important to be clear about one's own opinions. That's what he believed. She looked at him, surprised and silent. She didn't respond right away. Finally, Sarah, somewhat nervous, a bead of sweat running down her cheek, shyly replied that yes, that was true. Haruya looked at her carefully and deep down wondered if he had accidentally touched on a sensitive topic for her. The atmosphere between them grew a bit awkward. However, as he continued to watch her closely, something caught his interest. That's when Sarah broke the silence. She smiled sincerely, uplifted, and told him she wanted to thank him again for what had happened that day. She was happy to have had the chance to express her gratitude. With a kind smile, Sarah said goodbye, telling him that they would leave it there for today. Haruya smiled as well, with a soft glow in the background. Then, hesitating a little, he asked if she wanted him to walk her a bit farther. She was surprised by the offer. She didn't answer right away, but her expression said it all. Visibly nervous, Sarah replied that it was okay, that it wasn't necessary. With a slight hesitation, she made an excuse and left. The boy watched her walk away as he reflected. It seemed like she was in a bit of a hurry. At that moment, he wondered if he had made her uncomfortable, since perhaps they were more distant than he had thought. And so, he remained alone in the cafe, wearing a melancholic expression. He murmured to himself that he didn't think he would see her again, The next day at school, one of Sarah's friends exclaimed excitedly that it definitely felt like a fated encounter. The other two friends gathered around, sharing in the joy. One of them, Una, also commented that she found it incredible. Meanwhile, Rin asked if it wasn't amazing, to which Sarah, with a calm expression, replied that yes, it was, and added that she was glad she had been able to thank him. Meanwhile, from his desk, Haruya watched the scene in silence. He thought that Sarah had managed to meet again with the one who had rescued her that time. Rin, always cheerful and mischievous, said that inviting him to eat had truly been an embarrassing move. With a playful tone, she added that she wondered who was better, the person that Yuna and she were interested in, or the one Sarah liked. At that moment, Yuna remarked with interest that the more she heard about that boy, the more curious she was to meet him. Sarah, completely flushed and visibly nervous, firmly clarified that it wasn't like she liked him or anything. She said she had only met with him to say thank you, and that was why she invited him to eat, just that. Upon hearing this, Yuna and Rin burst out laughing. Both of them said that the current Sarah Chin looked super cute. In response, Sarah grew angry and blushed even more deeply, standing up with energy. She shouted that it wasn't what they thought, that she was being serious. Rin responded naturally that even her angry face was cute, and Yuna agreed, saying yes, she looked really cute. Sarah, frustrated, asked them to please stop making fun of her. At that moment, Haruya suddenly stood up from his seat, and as he left the classroom, he couldn't stop repeating to himself, "Wait." He walked through the hallway, completely overwhelmed. He thought that the more he heard what the class's beauties were saying, the more it felt like he had heard it somewhere before. Then, with a serious and slightly embarrassed expression, he adjusted his glasses, thinking maybe he was being too full of himself. He believed that the person Sarah was describing and the image he had of himself were quite different. Overwhelmed, he put his hands on his face, thinking there was no way it was him. He had left the classroom on impulse, without a clear reason. He said to himself that it would be better to go out and get some air. So he decided to head up to the school rooftop. From the empty hallway, he could see the door that led to the rooftop, and his eyes showed determination. Once there, he gazed at the spectacular sky and thought the view from that place was beautiful. He took off his glasses, thinking they were only useful for hiding, and they reflected too much, so he set them aside. As he arrived, he ran his fingers through his hair and murmured that it was beautiful. However, his face showed surprise when he recognized a voice. He thought he had heard that voice somewhere else before. At first, he thought it couldn't be possible, but then he was suddenly in shock at what he was seeing. As he turned, he saw Sarah standing in front of him. Upon recognizing him, she stammered a bit and said she was surprised. He stared at her, confused, and then she asked why he was there. The protagonist's face looked nervous, with beads of sweat sliding down his forehead, and he could only stammer out an excuse. Sarah smiled with a bright and happy expression and said with excitement that that meant they were at the same school. Now on the rooftop, they stood apart, facing each other. Sarah still looked surprised, repeating that she was shocked, since she hadn't expected they'd be at the same school. She closed her eyes with a wide smile and expressed her happiness, saying that their previous meeting had been by chance, and she never thought they'd end up studying at the same school, and that this made her very happy. The protagonist recalled overlapping images of Sarah and her friends talking. Then, it hit him all at once. His face was filled with confusion, sweat dripping down his cheeks, and he thought, disbelievingly, that they had been talking about him. Sarah, still in complete shock, brought her hands to her mouth. She still couldn't fully process that her hero was attending the same school. For his part, Haruya was internally screaming that it couldn't be, that what was happening just wasn't possible. With a suspicious look in his eyes, Haruya thought that, if he wasn't mistaken, the girls were talking about how Sarah had been saved from that persistent guy, as well as about the cafe outing. Both situations felt far too familiar to him. In a moment of shock, he exclaimed that he wasn't someone that cool, or at least, that's what he believed. He reflected that it had never once crossed his mind that the person they were talking about could be him. He stood there, deep in thought, wondering how things had ended up like this. In his mind, he imagined what others might be thinking. He pictured a very handsome guy, raising his hand with confidence while the girls looked at him with admiration. He figured that because of all this, the class was probably starting to picture some super attractive guy who, in reality, didn't even exist. As his imagination carried him further, a devastating scene came to mind. Sarah, with a dreamy look, declaring that her destined person was a classmate. He thought that if that happened, everyone would start searching among the students to figure out who it was. For that reason, he decided that if it came to that, he had to make absolutely sure she never found out he was Akasaki, her classmate. He began to panic, visibly nervous, thinking he had to avoid at all costs being held in such high regard by her. Meanwhile, Sarah was watching the sunset. Her long hair swayed gently in the breeze. She remarked that the sunset looked beautiful from that spot. Upon hearing her, Haruya's face showed surprise. Sarah, with a thoughtful expression and her gaze toward the sky, added that, actually, it was forbidden to enter the rooftop. Then she looked at him with a sharper expression and asked him directly if that wasn't true. He tried to justify himself, smiling nervously. Raising a finger, he explained that the doorknob was broken, and that's how he ended up there. However, Sarah pointed at him with authority and firmly explained that if it was forbidden, then he shouldn't have gone in, regardless of the door's condition. Haruya, sweating, awkwardly replied by nodding and saying yes. Yet, at that moment, he raised his voice and pointed out that she was also there, which clearly exposed a contradiction in her argument. The two of them stared at each other in silence. Haruya looked at her blankly, as an awkward, static moment formed between them. Sarah immediately noticed the flaw in her reasoning and looked visibly surprised. With a nervous tone, she tried to explain herself. She said she hadn't been able to calm down for various reasons, and that's why she ended up wandering around the school. Haruya, trying to understand her, smiled gently and said he got it. Then, Sarah looked toward the door and curiously remarked that maybe they should report the broken doorknob. Meanwhile, Haruya took in the view from the rooftop and thought that even if that were true, he didn't want to stop seeing that scenery. That's why he suggested that, regarding that matter, maybe there was no need to say anything. Sarah once again adopted a firm tone and with the same clear voice as before, reminded him that, as she had already said, they weren't supposed to be there. With determination, she stepped forward and announced that she would go report it to the teacher's office right away. However, Haruya quickly stopped her, grabbing her hand and shouting, "Please wait a moment." He held on to her hand firmly, and they stared into each other's eyes. Sarah was startled by the gesture, and her face showed a blush she couldn't hide. Without letting go of her hand, Haruya asked her for a favor. He promised he would do anything she wanted, as long as it was within his power, and pleaded with her to please keep what happened there a secret. Still surprised, Sarah repeated what she had just heard and, a little confused, murmured if he meant anything. Haruya reaffirmed his promise and answered that yes, that's what he meant. Sarah blushed, and with some shyness, proposed that in that case, she would like for them to exchange contact numbers. Haruya agreed, a bit nervous, and told her he had no problem with that. She smiled, visibly happy, and thanked him as she took out her phone. With a bit of hesitation, she showed him the screen and said that that was her contact number, asking in a trembling voice for him to please save it. Haruya did so without hesitation, and stammered slightly as he said, "Sure." Meanwhile, he thought that with a request like that, he had absolutely no complaints. Just then, Haruya flinched at the sight of his own screen and hastily shouted for them to wait a moment. He felt a wave of fear, thinking he might have been found out. Sarah, a little puzzled, asked what was wrong. Meanwhile, Haruya silently thought that he had nearly left his real name visible, which could have alerted Sarah. To cover it up, he turned his gaze toward the horizon and concluded that, for now, the wisest move would be to use the name of his favorite protagonist. So he changed his username and, with relief, thought that everything was now in order. Right after that, he apologized for the delay. Just as the transfer icon appeared on the screen, Sarah read the name on her phone and said out loud, "Asayuu-san," making it clear that she had saved the contact correctly. Haruya, pretending to be calm, replied with some uncertainty that yes, that was right. Then, driven by curiosity, Sarah asked if she could know which class he was in. Haruya paused, worried, Deep down he reasoned that if she actually looked into his class, he wouldn't be able to keep up the charade anymore. With urgency, he realized what he had to do. So, with apparent composure, he lied and said he was in first year, Class I. He reflected that if he wanted her not to think too highly of him, maybe saying nonsense like that could work. However, Sarah, smiling, showed a hint of suspicion. She repeated what he had said, and with an amused smile, confronted him in a teasing tone, asking what he was talking about. Since first year only went up to Class H, she laughed a little, remarking that he was quite an unusual person. Then she added that it was okay if he didn't want to tell her, that was fine. Haruya, feeling awkward, tried to apologize. He explained that, yes, he had a special situation, and apologized for that. Internally, he thought that after such an excuse, she was probably going to think he was just a liar. However, Sarah smiled kindly, and with her eyes closed, repeated his words. She told him there was no need to apologize so much, and added that she hoped they could get along. Still a bit nervous, Haruya replied that yes, he hoped the same. Then, more gently, Sarah spoke to him and mentioned that she was also in first year, so there was no need for him to be so formal. She added that she'd like it if, instead of calling her by her last name, he called her by her first name, confessing that would make her really happy. Faced with that request, Haruya remained silent for a moment. Sarah looked at him with curiosity and called him again by the name he had given. Finally, Haruya responded, trying to remain composed, and said that he hoped they could get along from now on. Then, with a bit of difficulty, he called her by her name. Sarah was surprised. Hearing her name come from Haruya's lips, she smiled with genuine happiness. With sincere joy, she said she hoped the same. However, at the same time, Haruya was thinking that if he could get her to form a poor opinion of him, maybe she and her friends would stop talking about him altogether. Later that night, Sarah was lying in bed, deep in thought. She stared up at the ceiling while holding her phone in both hands. A thought crossed her mind softly, like an inevitable sigh. She felt that, without realizing it, she had done something rather bold. As she kept thinking, she realized that Haruya hadn't called her by her last name, but by her first name, and somehow, that detail kept echoing in her mind. It felt strange to be chatting with a guy when she didn't even know what class he was in. The thought made her blush. With a bit more composure, she began to feel that this boy was truly a unique person. She looked at Haruya's profile on her phone, where the username still read Asayu. She couldn't deny how surprised she had been to discover that they both went to the same school. It was as if she were living out a scene from a shoujo manga. Suddenly, her reaction turned shy and nervous. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. She was trying to decide what kind of message would be appropriate to send. She thought maybe just a simple greeting would do, but didn't want it to sound too formal. She preferred something more casual and warm. As she was about to type something, she murmured to herself that maybe it would be better to just use a sticker. But then, she felt nervous again. She reflected that she had never had trouble knowing what to write in a message. But now, she didn't know what to do. She wondered why it was suddenly so hard. Then she sat up more seriously, crossed her arms, and thought clearly. She insisted to herself that this didn't mean she liked him. Rather, she just felt that she hadn't thanked him properly. And with that thought, Sarah finally made up her mind. She quietly said, "All right," and that she would send him a message. Slowly, her hands reached for her phone, while internally she screamed with nervousness that here she went. Immediately, she blushed as she reflected on her behavior throughout the day. Just as she had feared, she felt she had been acting a bit bold. Embarrassed, she flailed and threw herself onto the bed, hugging a pillow gently, as if seeking comfort in its softness. At that moment, she thought that maybe what she really wanted was to get a little closer to Asai-san. Without fully realizing it, those feelings had been gradually building up. Meanwhile, Haruya was in his room, silently staring at his phone. Although everything he had done was purely impulsive, he now had the number of Himekawa Sarah, one of the beauties of Class S, out of curiosity. He checked her profile on the screen, where it simply displayed the username Himekawa Sarah. Suddenly, a notification caught him by surprise. He froze and was startled by the thought that it might be a message from Sarah. At that possibility, he wondered what might be happening now. Somewhat astonished, he checked his phone and read a message where she said that, if it was okay with him, they could meet on the rooftop during lunch. Haruya let out a deep sigh. His face was tense, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Clearly, he was feeling stressed. Drained, he collapsed into his chair, reflecting on the situation. He wondered how he had ended up in something like this, when in theory, his original intention had been for Sarah to stop thinking so highly of him. The next day, as he entered the classroom, he was thinking about how he had barely slept because of last night's message. But then, Haruya jumped in fright when he heard Rin shouting at the top of her lungs. She, visibly surprised, was asking her friend since when she had managed to exchange numbers with her savior. That comment left the protagonist completely speechless. From his seat, Haruya watched as Sarah, Yuna, and Rin chatted cheerfully. As he looked at them, he thought that they had no idea how he actually felt, and he wondered what they might be talking about now. That was when Yuna, with a calm smile, said that everything felt incredible, like destiny was guiding Sarah's path. Meanwhile, Rin, her eyes sparkling with excitement, asked how it had all happened, how they had ended up exchanging numbers, and confessed enthusiastically that she was so curious. Sarah, a little nervous, simply replied that it was a secret. The girls reacted in unison, completely thrilled, exclaiming that it was just too cute. Rin, with a big smile, told her she looked truly adorable, and then, in a slightly more serious tone, asked why she was keeping it a secret. At that moment, Sarah decided to open up. She explained that her heart felt confused, and that both Rin and Yuna were wonderful people, which was why she preferred not to worry them too much. Rin and Yuna fell silent for a few seconds. Their faces reflected surprise. However, Yuna smiled sweetly and said she understood. She assured her that there was no need to worry so much about them, and that she could talk to them about it whenever she felt like it. As she reached out her hand kindly, she added that since Rin was as curious as ever, she herself would make sure to punish her if she pushed too hard. Rin, with tears in her eyes and exaggerated dramatics, protested, saying that it hurt so much and to please stop. That scene made Sarah laugh spontaneously, amused by the way they acted. From his seat, Haruya watched the scene and thought that, as usual, those girls got along incredibly well. He figured it was best to just sit quietly and not get involved. In the middle of that lively conversation, Sarah suddenly changed the subject, and with a curious tone, asked if the name Asai rang a bell. Haruya, upon hearing it, was completely shocked. As if an internal alarm had gone off, he instantly understood that Sarah was trying to discover his identity. Then Yuna, naturally, replied that it was the name of a protagonist in a shoujo manga, and asked why she was asking. Sarah explained that it was nothing in particular, just that someone she knew had commented that person seemed incredibly cool. At that moment, Rin frowned in doubt and thought aloud that, if she remembered correctly, Yuna didn't usually read manga. But at the same time, she asked if maybe she actually did. Yuna reacted with slight nervousness and quickly explained that no, it was actually her cousin who read that manga, and that she had heard the name from him. Upon hearing the explanation, Rin commented that it made sense, since Yuna didn't give the impression of being someone who read shoujo manga. Yuna, even more nervous, confirmed that was the case. Meanwhile, Sarah thought to herself that so that was the name of a character from a shoujo manga. At the same time, Haruya, feeling increasingly relieved, thought that it had been close, but in the end, it seemed like he had managed to escape. A little later, while climbing the stairs to the rooftop, he reflected on what had just happened. Judging by the expression she had shown a moment ago, her good opinion of him hadn't diminished at all. For that reason, he concluded he had no choice but to try lowering it during lunch. With renewed determination, he lightly patted both cheeks to cheer himself up. "All right," he told himself, and then, firmly, he opened the rooftop door. There, they met. Haruya greeted her naturally, and Sarah, surprised to see him, responded with sincere thanks for coming. Then, they sat down together. While they shared lunch, Sarah began slowly leaning closer to him. Haruya, clearly tense, pulled away without thinking much. She noticed his movement and smiled softly, telling him there was no need to sit so far away. Internally, he thought he had moved away on purpose. hoping to annoy her a little. At that moment, she glanced at the lunch he had. Haruya showed her a pack of sausages and wished her a good meal. Then, Sarah asked if he had bought it at the convenience store. Haruya explained that he lived alone and was honestly too lazy to cook. As he spoke, he thought that comment would make her see him as a total good for nothing. Enough for her to start seeing him differently. However, Sarah blushed slightly and, with a shy smile, offered him her bento. She told him that if he wanted, he could try some of hers. Haruya was stunned. Then she explained that, in fact, the reason she had called him up there was because she felt she hadn't properly thanked him. She clearly remembered how he had saved her from that person who had been bothering her, and how, just last week, he had behaved like a true gentleman. With a voice that was both firm and sweet, Sarah offered him the bento as a way to express her gratitude. Haruya thought that if it was a gesture of thanks, he couldn't reject it. However, accepting it felt like some kind of torture. Hesitating, he asked if it was really okay for him to eat her bento. Sarah answered naturally and offered him a pair of chopsticks. In that moment, Haruya thought that at this point, there was no turning back. He was going to eat it all. If he managed to finish it, maybe, just maybe, her high opinion of him would finally change. As he ate, he felt a bit guilty, but if it helped him reach his goal, then it was worth it. Sarah watched him in amazement. When he finished, the bento was completely empty. Haruya, with a mix of satisfaction and embarrassment, commented that it had been delicious, but then he immediately felt awkward, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Sarah looked at him warmly, and with a cheerful expression, proposed that if he was okay with it, they could start eating lunch together from now on. She added enthusiastically that she would be waiting for him at the same spot the next day as well. Haruya, nervous, replied with a forced smile, saying, "Sure, then I'll see you." But inside, he could only scream at himself, unable to understand why everything was turning out the opposite of what he'd intended. She cheerfully said goodbye, thanking him again, and ran off with a radiant expression. Haruya remained silent, wondering whether this time he had finally managed to change her opinion of him. But he couldn't find a clear answer. He only felt a strange, hollow sensation. Later, as he walked down the hallway back to his classroom, he thought that lunch break was already over and that he felt exhausted. In the distance, he saw Rin, Yuna, and Sarah chatting animatedly. Sarah was speaking with a joyful expression. She said that it was truly rewarding when someone enjoyed a bento you had prepared with such excitement. Rin replied that she completely understood, and that something like that would make her really happy, too. Meanwhile, Yuna, sincerely, commented that even though she hadn't experienced it herself yet, she could totally understand the feeling. With a playful tone, Rin asked Sarah what had happened, pointing out that she hadn't been around during lunch. Yuna added that she had also found her absence quite noticeable. Sarah, nervous, replied that it wasn't what they were thinking, though she admitted that she felt a little excited when she imagined it. From a distance, Haruya observed the scene, clearly confused. He wondered if all of that was actually true. He didn't understand how she could be so happy. He thought she should have been really upset. After all, he had eaten her entire bento. But then, he remembered the words she had said herself. At first, Sarah thought Haruya was only doing it out of politeness. However, when she saw how much he was genuinely enjoying her food, she realized his reaction was completely sincere. She didn't have much confidence in her cooking, but seeing him eat with such appetite helped her understand that he wasn't doing it just to be courteous. To her, the amount he ate was a reflection of the level of trust between them. As she reflected on this, she wondered if Asai-san had also noticed that detail. Rin, with her usual enthusiasm, wished her the chance to share another meal with that person. Yuna, for her part, also showed her support, accompanying her words with a warm smile. Sarah, deeply moved, felt that both of them were looking at her with a hint of envy, but a kind, affectionate one. For the first time, she experienced such an overwhelming sense of fulfillment that she felt radiant. Gratefully, she thanked them with joy. Meanwhile, Haruya, completely in shock, thought he couldn't allow this to continue. He had the awful impression that instead of lowering Sarah's opinion of him, he had only succeeded in raising it even more. He recalled every single one of their interactions and concluded that everything he had done so far had produced exactly the opposite result. The only good thing, he reasoned, was that she still didn't know his true identity, and that was something he had to protect at all costs. Determined, he grabbed his phone, typed a message, and sent it. In it, he asked Nayu-san if they could meet that very night. She replied, "Yes, of course." Later that night, in front of a building, Haruya met with Nayu. He was clearly nervous. He explained that he knew it was a sudden request, but that he needed to talk about something important, and asked her to hear him out. Nayu, wearing dark sunglasses and a hoodie, calmly replied with irony, asking if he really thought she could say no. Once seated, she looked annoyed. She remarked that she had come because he'd insisted on setting up an offline meeting so suddenly, and now it turned out he just wanted to know how to make a classmate stop thinking so highly of him. With sarcasm, she asked if he was just trying to show off. Haruya, sweating nervously, replied that of course that wasn't it. That's when Nayu proposed something he didn't expect at all. She told him to ask her out on a date. Haruya panicked the moment he heard those words. Nayu, still in a calm tone, explained that if they spent time together, Sarah would eventually realize what he was really like. The next day, Haruya was feeling more and more depressed as he thought about everything that had happened. Lunchtime was approaching, and anxiety was starting to crush him. Just seriously considering the idea of that date left him exhausted. Even though Nayu-san had suggested it, the idea just seemed like too much. He reflected that now he had no choice. He had to invite her on a date. Just thinking about it made him so nervous that he began to feel physically ill. As he walked with awkward steps, he kept telling himself that all of this was for one single purpose: to get her to stop thinking so highly of him. And so, he made it to the rooftop. However, before stepping inside, he froze. From above, Sarah cheerfully greeted him, saying that he'd arrived, and asked how his day had been. Haruya, visibly tense, tried to respond, but only managed to mumble a few words. Sarah, noticing his discomfort, gently asked what was wrong. That's when Haruya gathered his courage. He confessed that, in truth, he'd like to get to know her better. And with unexpected sincerity, he asked if she would like to go on a date with him that weekend. Sarah was completely shocked. Her mind was trying to process what she had just heard, while internally, she could only repeat the word date. Her face turned bright red, and with a glowing expression, she replied that if he was okay with it, she'd be delighted. Haruya could barely react. He clumsily nodded, still nervous, and said yes, that it sounded good to him. And that's how the day of the date arrived. A date that, ironically, had been suggested by someone else. Covering his face in embarrassment, he walked with his head down, because at that very moment, he found himself in a rather awkward situation. He was walking, head bowed, holding hands with a small girl, while a police officer watched him from a distance with a confused expression. And as all this was happening, Haruya could only think one thing, that he was about to be late for his date, and to make matters worse, he was already having trouble with the police. The police officer called out to Haruya, pointing at the child who was with him. Though Haruya was sweating from the rush, he kept a smile on his face as he explained that he had seen the child looking lost, and thought his mother might be with the officer, which was why he had brought him there. The officer nodded, understanding the situation. He assured Haruya that he would take care of the child from that point on, and with a slight smile, added that the boy seemed to have taken a liking to him. However, he also noted that Haruya probably had something to do. Haruya, encouraged and visibly relieved, confirmed that he did. He had just messaged Sarah to let her know he'd be late, and the officer commented that he could already tell from his face that something had been worrying him for a while. Then Haruya looked at his phone, the message still open. He whispered a quiet apology to Sarah for the delay. Right after, he hurried his pace, thinking he needed to get there quickly. He reflected, with a hint of irony, that even before the date had begun, he had already managed to damage his reputation, though not in the way he had intended. He finally arrived at the agreed meeting spot and greeted her, apologizing for being late. Sarah, upon seeing him, asked if something had happened. Haruya said no, that he had just been delayed. She smiled and, in a kind tone, asked if he had any plans for the day. Haruya, regaining his enthusiasm, assured her that he did, and that everything was already decided, so he asked her to leave it all to him. With sweetness, Sarah replied that in that case, she would be in his care. Haruya felt confident that from that moment on, he would lead the date. Deep inside, he firmly promised himself that he would definitely manage to lower Sarah's overly favorable impression of him. Seeing him thoughtful, she asked where they would be going. And so, the two of them began walking together to their next destination. They had lunch together, and Sarah looked delighted. Afterwards, they visited an ice skating rink. Later, Sarah was surprised to find herself in front of a shooting game at an amusement center. While seated in a rest area, Haruya remarked that they had played a lot, and Sarah confirmed it with a smile. Haruya recalled that they had eaten at the well-known restaurant chain Kuya. Then, at the large entertainment center, he had challenged her several times, but had lost every single one. Even though he felt he had done his best, he also thought the result was pathetic. He figured that, since he hadn't won even once, his reputation had finally dropped. With a resigned sigh, Haruya commented that, by the way, Sarah had really good reflexes. She replied confidently, saying that after all, she was a Haimkawa. Haruya, a bit confused, wondered if lineage really had anything to do with that kind of skill. He thought it was unlikely that Haimkawa-san's athleticism was something directly inherited from her family. That was when Sarah, with a serious expression, began to speak about her background. She explained that she came from a family with strict, conservative traditions, which made it natural for her to excel in both academics and sports. Haruya reflected on what it must mean to belong to the Haimkawa family. He imagined harsh training and wondered whether it came with constant pressure not to dishonor the family name. With empathy, Haruya expressed that even if it was a family rule, it couldn't be easy to deal with. He mentioned that if it were him, he'd probably run away or rebel immediately. Then he thought that no matter how much support others gave you, or how good your circumstances were, in the end, effort had to come from within. Besides, he felt that blaming his defeat solely on the fact that she was the daughter of the Haimkawa family was an exaggeration, and the idea didn't quite sit right with him. So, sincerely and without hesitation, he told her that it wasn't because of her family name. It was because she was truly amazing. He added gently that, at least, that was what he thought. Sarah was surprised, deeply moved by his words. All she could do was softly whisper a grateful, "Thank you." Suddenly, they both heard a sound, a footstep. They turned at the same time and saw a small girl running toward them, happily shouting Haruya's name. Sarah, a bit confused, quietly murmured to herself, wondering who that girl was. Haruya, nervous, tried to calm the situation and told her not to worry about it. Meanwhile, Miyu, full of excitement, kept running and shouting the protagonist's name at the top of her lungs. From behind, Miyu's mother called out to her in concern, telling her she shouldn't run off alone without saying anything. But at that moment, Miyu cheerfully shouted back that the boy in front of her was Haruya. Seeing him up close, the mother looked surprised and asked if he might be Haruya-san, the same person who had taken Miyu to the police. Upon hearing his real name, not the false one he had been using until then, Haruya was instantly in shock. He couldn't help but panic and thought everything was over. Hearing that name, Sarah fell into brief thought. Trying to salvage the situation, Haruya gave a forced smile and told her that, for today, their outing was over. However, Sarah, startled, asked him to wait, and with a firm voice told him that they couldn't just end their date like that. At that, Haruya clenched his teeth, convinced that he had been found out. Then Sarah told him that, after hearing the story, she had come to a realization. She asked if he had been late because he helped that little girl. Haruya, visibly nervous, confirmed that yes, that was the reason. As a result, Sarah concluded by saying she would have preferred if he had just told her from the start. This sudden reaction left Haruya completely confused. However, Sarah, with a kind smile, said that even though it was an unexpected surprise to find out that he had used a fake name, she wasn't angry. In response, Haruya sincerely apologized, truly remorseful, and explained that he had his reasons. In his mind, he thought about how he hadn't wanted to cause trouble at school or draw attention in class. Fortunately, Sarah answered with understanding, telling him it was okay, that she understood, and that he didn't need to worry. Haruya, however, said nothing more. He simply remained silent. Despite Sarah's reassuring words, he couldn't feel at ease at all. He felt like his peaceful school life was hanging by a thread, and all he could do was pray internally. As for Sarah, she was happy. She said goodbye with a smile, telling him they'd see each other at school.